The Last Fire, Rostam Farrokhzad, and the Mourning of Iran. An Epic Reckoning in 10 Laments by Elias Winter, July 23, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Opening. Before there was defeat, there was fire. Not the kind you kindle for warmth, but the kind the world arranges itself around. A flame kept alive by generations who believed, with the ferocity only survivors know, that meaning is not inherited. It is defended. That is how Iran began. Not with a sword or a flag, but with a priest tending to a sacred blaze beneath an unyielding sky. This was the first contract. That light must not yield to the dark, and that the fate of empires turns on the quiet insistence that the world is a battleground, not for territory, but for truth. Centuries later, as the Sassanian Empire groaned under the weight of its own memory, a different fire swept the horizon. This time it arrived not as symbol, but as ultimatum. Arab horsemen carrying the Qur'an in one hand and the edge of history in the other. The question was never simply who would rule, but whether the meaning of loss itself could be transmuted, whether the vanquished could become the authors of their own defeat, scribes of a sorrow no conqueror could erase. This is the story of Rostam Farrokhzad, the last lion of Iran, the man who bore the shame of a world undone and became, by his end, the measure of what Iran could not forget. To tell his story is to trespass into a mourning that never ended, to light again the fire of memory, and to reckon with the fate of a people who learned to turn loss into liturgy.
Chapter 1. Before the Storm, Sassanian Iran at its zenith. There are epochs when a civilization believes itself immune to oblivion. The Sassanian Empire, standing astride the bones of older empires, was such a civilization, a world that did not yet know how near it lived to the edge of its own forgetting. Before the first Arab horseman crossed the desert with his tongue full of new scripture, before the world fractured at Qadisiyah, there was this. Fire tended in silence, kings enthroned beneath vaults of turquoise, a map of Iran drawn not by borders, but by the logic of flame and law. The Sassanian world was the afterlife of the Achaemenids, the inheritance of Cyrus and Darius, worn down into ritual, bureaucracy, pride. History likes to call this a golden age, but golden ages are never innocent. The court at Ctesiphon glimmered with ceremony and threat, priests in white robes whispering the names of lost gods, nobles trading oaths and betrayals beneath the arch of Tak Kasra. Zoroastrianism was more than religion. It was the architecture of meaning itself. Every act, taxes levied, laws decreed, swords drawn, was staged as a drama between Asher and Druge, order and lie. Society was disciplined to the point of fracture. At the apex, the Shahanshah, king of kings, anointed in the smoke of sacred fire. Beneath him, the aristocracy, houses with names older than the empire itself, Mihran, Karen, Suren, Spandiad. These families remembered when Persia was a verb, not a memory. They owned the land, the law, the right to rebel. Beneath them, the city folk, merchants of Nishapur, scholars of Ray, artisans shaping silver and silk for a trade route that stitched Iran to China and Byzantium. The Deccans, the landed gentry, kept order in the countryside, collecting taxes for kings they despised, keeping the peace that would, in time, betray them. This was an age where the boundary between the divine and the political was paper-thin. Fire temples rose over every horizon, anchoring a cosmology that claimed the world could be kept whole through vigilance and sacrifice. But beneath the discipline ran cracks, sectarian resentments, a bureaucracy bloated by triumph and then rot, a population weary from the tax collector and the conscript's whip. Outwardly, the Sassanian state was vast, stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, trading letters and hostilities with Rome and Byzantium, holding back Turks and nomads at its margins. Inwardly, it was haunted by the memory of too many enemies and the secret knowledge that every empire is one missed harvest away from collapse. This was the world that would call forth Rostam Farrokhzad, a world not yet aware that its greatest hero would also be its last. The empire still believed it was the steward of order in a universe wired for meaning. It did not yet know that history was already sharpening its blade, that soon the fires would be tended by strangers, and that mourning would become the only ceremony Iran could not abolish.
Chapter 2. Shadows Gather. Crisis and Decline. History rarely announces catastrophe at the gates. It seeps in quietly, through the seams of greatness, the cracks between victories, the silence after a festival, the muttered curses of those who serve but no longer believe. So it was with Sassanian Iran. Before the swords of Arabia, it was undone by shadows of its own making. It is easy to mythologize decline as a single fall, a tragic note in the music of empire. But the end began not with defeat in battle, but with exhaustion. An exhaustion written on the faces of kings, in the ledgers of tax collectors, and in the prayers of those who watched the flames in the fire temples grow dimmer year by year. After the long reign of Khosrow II, who, for a moment, had pushed the frontiers to the Nile and the gates of Constantinople, the empire discovered that every triumph exacts its price. Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, struck back, burning deep into the heart of Persia, torching the granaries of certainty. What followed was not merely military defeat, but the breakdown of legitimacy itself. The king murdered by his own son, the throne shuffling between children, puppets, and claimants, in a deadly game whose rules changed by the hour. The old names, Mihran, Spandiad, Surin, became less titles of loyalty than banners of faction. The aristocracy, once a bulwark, became scavengers of their own inheritance. Civil war bled into famine. Plague hollowed out the towns. Nobles retreated behind their walls. Priests lost their grip on the peasantry, and the countryside simmered with hunger and silence. On the empire's edges, enemies circled. Nomads tested the eastern marches. In the south, along the borderlands of Iraq and the Arabian desert, something new was stirring, a force not of mercenaries or raiders, but of believers. The Persian court heard rumors, ignored them, and then, too late, sent orders to fortify a frontier already breached by history itself. But this is what must be understood. Iran fell first not to the sword, but to a failure of memory. It forgot that its greatest strength had always been the capacity to endure loss and transmute it into meaning. Now, with the monarchy reduced to a rumor, the nobility fractured, and the priests powerless to kindle more than nostalgia, the stage was set for a reckoning. In this gathering darkness, a few names did not collapse into despair. Among them, the house of Farrokhzad. Rostam, inheritor of both pride and catastrophe, watched the world of his ancestors unravel. He did not turn away. In an age of betrayal, he chose, against every omen and incentive, to stand with the ruins. This is where the story changes register. The shadows that gathered were not only harbingers of defeat, but the crucible from which Iran's last champion would rise. The empire mourned itself, but not yet without a fight.
Chapter 3. The House of Farrokhzad, Nobility and Fate. Some families are born for twilight. The Farrokhzads belonged to a caste that measured time not by kings, but by the ebb and flow of catastrophe, a house whose fortunes rose when empires trembled. To speak the name Farrokhzad was to invoke not just lineage, but destiny, that double-edged Persian word, bakht, both fortune and fate. They were of the house of Mihran, a branch whose roots snaked back to Parthian glory, lords of Ray, landowners by ancient right, bred for war and schooled in the discipline of fire and oath. Rostam Farrokhzad did not inherit an empire, but something older, the expectation to become a wall against the tide, a vessel for whatever remnant of dignity the age could not erase. His father, Farrokhzad, had been more than a general. He was, for a brief, flickering moment, the power behind a crumbling throne, the de facto sovereign in an empire allergic to unity. It was from him that Rostam learned the burdens of stewardship, how to govern through chaos, how to extract loyalty from men made cynical by too much history, how to stand unseduced by the easy betrayals of court and kin. Ray, their ancestral seat, was more than a city. It was a crossroads of trade, of faith, of the rumor that Persian identity could survive even the death of Persian kings. Here the Farrokhzads kept their own courts, commanded their own armies, preserved their own memories. To be a Mihran was to remember the world before the Sassanian, and to suspect it might outlast them too. But this is the secret of nobility in a dying order. Loyalty becomes heavier as legitimacy dissolves. The Wuzogan, once the crown's right hand, now ruled like small kings and looked to Ctesiphon only when compelled by fear or nostalgia. Beneath the velvet of privilege ran the iron of self-preservation. The king's word could still command, but only as long as there was someone like Rostam to embody it. We do not know the details of Rostam's childhood. The archives have vanished, the poems are silent, but we can see the shape of his formation in the choices he would make. Relentless, unyielding, both inside the game and above it. His Zoroastrian faith was not abstraction, but marrow, discipline as spiritual defense, tradition as weapon. The child of a world already trembling, he learned early that history would ask not what he achieved, but what he was willing to lose for what could not be saved. When civil war killed his father and threw the empire into further chaos, Rostam and his brother Farrokhzad inherited not just land and titles, but a mandate to hold the line, however briefly, against the extinction of their world. In that bequest was a paradox, one that would define the man and haunt the memory, to be both the shield and the mourner, the last practitioner of an art whose purpose was not victory, but remembrance. This is the weight of the Farrokhzad name, a family fated to turn the end of things into a ceremony, to translate defeat into dignity, to show the future what it means to lose and still not betray the fire.
Chapter 4. Lion of the Empire. Rostam's military ascendancy. In an age collapsing under the weight of its own legend, there are men who do not retreat. Rostam Farrokhzad was one such man, a figure who refused nostalgia, who chose instead the hard labor of command when command had become a sentence, not a privilege. Where others measured power by its proximity to the throne, Rostam measured it by his willingness to be hated, envied, or left alone, so long as the empire did not fall unresisted. His ascent was not marked by ceremony, but by necessity. After his father's murder and the hollowing of the court, Rostam returned to Ray and made himself indispensable, restoring order to provinces left to anarchy, subduing lesser nobles who had mistaken chaos for opportunity, rebuilding garrisons from the corpses of old loyalties. Here was a Persian trait too little noted by conquerors: the capacity to extract structure from ruin, to demand discipline when the wages of faithlessness were everywhere on display. He became both spa-bed and vizier, general and counselor, guardian of a monarchy that was now an act of collective imagination. To the boy king Yazdegerd III, Rostam was protector and gatekeeper. To the demoralized nobility, he was both threat and last hope. Power flowed toward him not out of love, but out of the clarity that nothing else stood between Iran and the dark. Even his enemies, Persian and Arab alike, admitted his stature. They saw a man both severe and just, whose personal discipline radiated out, pulling fractured allegiances into a single line of defense. Rostam punished betrayal without pleasure, rewarded loyalty without favoritism, and suffered fools only when the state required it. He had none of the optimism that marks new orders. He understood too well that the empire was not so much living as enduring itself. His genius was a form of tragic clarity, knowing that the task was impossible, but that refusing it was a kind of betrayal that echoed longer than defeat. As chief architect of the imperial defense, Rostam moved through a world already mourning its lost certainties. The army he inherited was a mosaic of wounded pride, elite cataphracts reduced by plague and defeat, foot soldiers conscripted from hungry villages, provincial levies whose loyalty ran no deeper than the purse. Yet he forged from these fragments a force that could, for a moment, pretend at unity. What set him apart was not merely his ability to command, but to perceive the threat rising from the south for what it was. Where other nobles saw only raiders, Rostam discerned the contours of a new faith, a movement that sought not just land or tribute, but the unmaking of the very narrative that sustained the old world. He fought not only for land, but for the right to mourn what would soon be lost. The burden was absolute. It is the fate of the last champion to know, even as he leads, that he is writing the script of his own elegy. This was Rostam's ascendancy, not the triumph of a savior, but the appointment of a witness, chosen by disaster, compelled by a dignity that could not be bartered for survival. The Lion of Iran, aware that the pride was gone, but refusing to let the desert take the bones without a fight.
Chapter 5. The Challenge from the South. Islam on the March. Every empire fears the enemy it cannot name. For Sassanian Iran, the threat that would consume it arrived with a vocabulary no Persian strategist had learned to decipher, a language of certainty that made light of tradition and erased negotiation. The Arab conquests were not an accident of geography or the drift of hungry tribes. They were a rupture in the grammar of history itself. While Rostam Farrokhzad was gathering the fragments of Persian power, something irreversible was happening on the southern frontier. In the empty spaces of Arabia, a new force was assembling, bound not by the usual chains of tribal oath or dynastic calculation, but by the terrifying lucidity of belief. Islam did not propose a treaty with the old world. It announced its irrelevance. It is tempting, in retrospect, to see this as inevitable, a rising faith meeting a tired empire. But inevitability is a lie whispered after the fact. In the moment, the Persians saw only warning signs, rumors from the border, raiders emboldened, garrisons overrun, local satraps sending panicked dispatches to a court too consumed by its own succession crises to care. Yet there were those, like Rostam, who understood that these were not mere raids. The Arabs had become something new. They marched under the banner of a book, with the discipline of men convinced that history itself was bending to their will. For the Persians, accustomed to the slow churn of dynastic time, the pace of this new conquest was incomprehensible. Cities fell not over years, but in the span of a single season. Why did the Arabs march north? Not simply for plunder or pasture, though these were prizes, but because they believed they were agents of a divine command. And history, in its most pitiless aspect, favors those who believe the future is their inheritance. The first clashes were tests. Persian commanders, steeped in the memory of earlier victories, underestimated the danger. At Dat al-Salasil, at Walaja, at Hira, the old equations failed. Cavalry charges that once shattered foes met men who did not scatter, but regrouped. The Arab armies absorbed defeat as prophecy. Each loss became a lesson, each retreat a prelude to return. By the time news reached Ctesiphon that the Muslims had crossed the Euphrates and were laying claim to the breadbasket of Mesopotamia, the old tools of imperial defense, diplomacy, intimidation, tribute, had become theatre. Rostam, whose mind ran years ahead of his peers, understood that this was a war not just for territory, but for the power to tell the story of what had been lost. The call to arms was sounded. Rostam demanded and received authority to muster the last, tattered remnants of an army worthy of the name. His orders were final, his strategy the product of desperation and vision alike. Draw the Arabs into pitched battle, where numbers and tradition might still count for something, where the old world could be defended with the last of its blood. The sense of crisis was total, but not shared equally. Among the court, fatalism had already taken root. Some saw the Arab advance as punishment for forgotten pieties, others as the outcome of treachery among their own. Rostam alone saw what was at stake, not just the land or the throne, but the right of a civilization to survive its defeat with memory intact. Qadisiyah was now inevitable. It would not just be a battle, but a referendum on the meaning of loss. The armies would gather, and Iran, in the body of its last lion, would face the mirror of its own vanishing.
Chapter 6. Qadisiyah, the 3-day reckoning. History remembers some battles not for the brilliance of their tactics, but for the silence they leave behind. The silence of a world that realizes too late that the future has already chosen its victor. Qadisiyah was such a reckoning. It was not simply a clash of armies, but an unmaking. The place where the story of Iran was torn from the lips of its chroniclers and handed, forever, to the victors. Rostam Farrokhzad stood at the center of it all, armored not in hope, but in a species of defiant grief. The Persian host that assembled on the plain was vast by the standards of a dying order. Regiments of cataphracts, war elephants chained to fate, provincial levies, and the tattered pride of a nobility that still remembered when a Persian king meant something to the world. Yet the grandeur was brittle. The ranks were swollen with the reluctant and the resigned, men called not by faith, but by obligation, or the absence of anywhere else to go. Opposite them, the Muslim army, smaller but unbroken by division, burned with the lucidity of the newly chosen. They carried neither nostalgia nor doubt. Their unity was not purchased by fear, but forged in the certainty that their cause was history itself. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the Arab commander, offered terms. Rostam refused, not because he believed in victory, but because there are moments when surrender is a deeper wound than annihilation. The battle began as all endings do, with ritual and bravado, drums echoing over dust, elephants charging, arrows blackening the sky. The first day was confusion, neither side yielding. But even then, the balance was already shifting. The Persian war elephants, creatures of terror in old campaigns, were made vulnerable by the Arabs' improvisation, their handlers targeted, their bulk turned into chaos. What had once been an emblem of imperial invincibility became a symbol of the world's reversal. On the second and third days, the Persian lines faltered. Rumors of betrayal drifted through the camp. Some nobles deserted, others fought with the desperation of men wagering their names against the erasure of everything they loved. Rostam moved among his troops like a revenant, demanding order from panic, promising only the dignity of resistance. The stories say a sandstorm swept across the field, turning day to blindness, blowing into the eyes of the Persian lines, a wind that, in later memory, would become a sign, an omen, a verdict delivered by the world itself. The Muslims pressed the attack. The Persian center broke, the elephants stampeded, and the old world collapsed in the dust. Rostam's death was the punctuation to this defeat. Accounts disagree. Some say he was killed as he rested, others that he fell fighting, his body lost in the river, unburied and unwept. What matters is not the detail, but the symbolism. With Rostam's fall, the last argument for Persian endurance was silenced. The armies of Iran scattered. Ctesiphon was left exposed, the fire altars abandoned, the memory of empire left to smolder in the ruins. What Qadisiyah destroyed was not just a military order, but the story Iran told about itself. The silence that followed was not peace, but the birth of a mourning that would outlast the conquerors. A ceremony of loss recited in every future generation.
Chapter 7. The Fall of a Dynasty, Aftermath and Ruin. When an empire falls, it rarely falls all at once. The world does not end in a scream, but in the slow unweaving of certainty, the loss of ritual, the emptying of palaces, the hush that settles over cities where even the air remembers the sound of command. After Qadisiyah, the Sassanian Empire did not simply die. It unraveled, strand by strand, until the very idea of Iran became an ache rather than a presence. The road to Ctesiphon, once the axis of the known world, was open, and the Arab armies advanced almost without resistance. The news preceded them, carried not by messengers, but by the fleeing nobility, by the priest who abandoned his temple, by the artisan who buried his sacred fire beneath the floorboards. The empire had lost its center, and with it, the gravity that held its fragments together. Ctesiphon itself, seat of kings, repository of centuries, fell without a siege worthy of its legend. Its halls were stripped, its libraries looted or torched, its courts reduced to echoes. Treasures of faith and state, gems, armor, scriptures, the wisdom of 100 generations, scattered like the dust that now claimed its mosaics. What had been a world was now a spoil, parcelled out to strangers. Yazdegerd III, the last king, became a fugitive, his sovereignty reduced to the distance between one sanctuary and the next. He moved from Hulwan to Rai, then east to Merv, the royal treasury dwindling to bribes for temporary loyalty. Each city he entered was a little more silent, a little less willing to pretend that the world could be made whole again by his presence. The Persian state, hollowed by betrayal, survived only in the desperation of its defenders. As city after city fell, Hamadan, Isfahan, Ray, the illusion of restoration faded. Sassanian generals and nobles, those who could, fled to the east. Others went underground. Some offered reluctant allegiance to the new rulers. The Zoroastrian priesthood, stripped of royal patronage, faded into irrelevance or exile. Iran, which had once been the axis around which lesser worlds revolved, was now a memory kept alive by the stubbornness of language and grief. Yazdegerd's end was not fit for tragedy, only for exhaustion. Betrayed by a local miller, murdered for the price of his clothes, his body left to be found by no one in particular. The last Shahanshah joined the procession of vanished kings, whose names would become prayers for what could never return. In the wake of all this, what was left? Not simply the wreckage of palaces or the plunder of libraries, but the birth of a new Iran, an Iran forced to choose between erasure and transformation. The old world was gone, but the wound remained open, the mourning unspent. The conquerors claimed the land, but not the memory. The Persian genius for survival began its work, transmuting disaster into ritual, loss into myth, the ruins of empire into the architecture of longing. This is what makes Iran different from its conquerors. It learns how to lose without letting defeat become the last word. The Sassanian dynasty was ended, but the Persian refusal to be ended was just beginning.
Chapter 8. Legend and Lament. Rostam in Persian Memory. No conqueror understands what it means to be remembered by the vanquished. After the banners are hauled down and the laws rewritten, after the last embers of the sacred fire are snuffed out, a different fire begins. One kindled in the language of lament, the stubborn ritual of remembering. Rostam Farrokhzad, annihilated at Qadisiyah, did not vanish. He multiplied in story, becoming the axis of a grief Iran would not permit the world to resolve. The mourning for Rostam was not the mourning of defeat alone. It was the invention of meaning after catastrophe, a way of rescuing dignity from the jaws of annihilation. In the centuries that followed, the figure of Rostam grew, not diminished. He became less a man than a cipher, the last guardian, the faithful failure, the witness who turns disaster into inheritance. Oral traditions, hungry for solace, recast him as both martyr and mirror. The story was no longer about a general who lost a battle, but about the keeper of an age, betrayed by fate and the rot of those he tried to defend. In folk retellings, Rostam's death became a moral lesson. That virtue alone cannot save a world that has forgotten how to recognize it, and that the gravest wounds are inflicted not by the enemy, but by the cowardice and vanity of one's own side. For poets and priests, Rostam became the measure of all that was lost: his loyalty, his discipline, his refusal to flee. In mourning him, Iran learned to mourn itself without surrender. The fall of the Sassanids was transmuted into a black day. Ruz-e-Siyah, repeated in elegies, sermons, and the quiet sighs of those forced to bow in strange courts. Even after Iran learned to speak Arabic and pray toward Mecca, the shadow of Rostam remained, a residue the new rulers could neither erase nor fully comprehend. His name became both warning and invocation. In every later crisis, as new conquerors rode in and new kings declared themselves Shah, the lament for Rostam was revived. A dirge for unity squandered, for loyalty repaid with silence, for the knowledge that history always returns to test what a people are willing to lose rather than betray. In this, the Persian genius for survival is revealed. The art of turning grief into ceremony, and ceremony into identity. The conquerors took the palaces, but they could not outlaw the ache. Rostam Farrokhzad became the axis of a myth that gave shape to centuries of Persian resistance and self-recovery. To this day, the story of Rostam is less a lesson than a wound that refuses to scar, a reminder that what is mourned honestly cannot be truly lost.
Chapter 9. From History to Epic, Rostam and the Shahnameh. To survive defeat is to become legend. To survive conquest is to become language. For Persians, the work of remembering did not end with the telling of history. It began anew in the making of epic. Rostam Farrokhzad, the man, was fated to vanish at Qadisiyah. Rostam, the symbol, was destined to live wherever Iranians refused to forget themselves. Here, the alchemy of mourning reaches its fullest art. The story of one man's last stand is fused with the collective unconscious, then written anew by the poet who understood loss as destiny. Ferdowsi, writing the Shahnameh in the ruins of conquest, did not merely chronicle the past. He rebuilt it, syllable by syllable, in the only medium the conquerors could not confiscate: epic verse. In the Shahnameh, there are two Rostams. The first is mythic. Rostam, son of Zal, slayer of monsters, defender of kings, a hero so old his origins dissolve into fable. The second, less explicit but always present, is the shadow of the real. Rostam Farrokhzad, the doomed sparbed whose death signals the end of the Iranian world. The two are not the same, but in the Persian imagination, they become indistinguishable. Every lament for the legendary Rostam is also a lament for the lost general, and every recitation of his final battle is a code for remembering the real wound of Qadisiyah. Ferdowsi's project was not nostalgia, but resistance. By making epic out of defeat, he denied the conquerors their last wish, the wish to be the sole authors of memory. In his verse, the virtues of the lost world, courage, justice, loyalty unto death, are transmuted into a standard by which every later age can be measured and found wanting. The fall of Rostam, mythic or historic, is never just a story about the past. It is a living rebuke to the present. The fusion of history and epic is not accident, but necessity. For a people forced to pray in another's language, epic becomes both shield and scripture. In the Shahnameh, the line between legend and fact is dissolved, not to escape reality, but to insist that reality is what the vanquished choose to remember and transmit. In this ritual of epic, defeat is not erased, but reworked, turned into the very medium of survival. Rostam, whether of Zabel or Farrokhzad, becomes the archetype of tragic resistance. The last loyalist, the doomed protector, the hero whose loss gives future generations the gift and burden of not forgetting. Thus, every time the Shahnameh is recited, Iran rehearses its own undying refusal to vanish, a refusal born not from victory, but from the artistry of grief.
Chapter 10. Echoes of Defeat. Iran's Long Shadow. There are wounds that refuse closure, not because healing is impossible, but because the wound itself becomes the source of meaning. In the shadow of Rostam Farrokhzad's defeat, across centuries of conquest, conversion, and ceaseless return, the Persian mind learned a paradox, that sometimes a nation survives not by overcoming loss, but by making an altar of it. The conquest of Iran was never only a political act. It was a breach in cosmic order, a violent eviction from the center of history. For generations, Persians mourned not only their kings, but the very architecture of their world. The fire temples stilled, the language of prayers transmuted, the festival days renamed. Yet even as Iran's public face changed, a counter-history flourished underground, in poetry, ritual, rumor, and the stubborn aftertaste of the forbidden. Rostam's defeat at Qadisiyah became a kind of secret text, endlessly interpreted and returned to in times of danger or humiliation. For some, it was a warning against division, a reminder that the price of disunity is always paid in generations of exile. For others, it was a source of resilience, the proof that even in annihilation, the old virtues endure if they are remembered and rehearsed. Throughout Iran's later history, under Mongol devastation, Ottoman encroachment, or the manipulations of foreign empires, the myth of noble loss, rooted in Rostam's fall, resurfaced as a tool of defiance and a grammar for national renewal. In every crisis, the question returned: will we betray the fire, or will we carry it, hidden and holy, through the darkness that others call our end? The greatest act of Persian memory is not to mourn what was lost, but to refashion mourning itself as continuity. Dynasties fell and languages changed, yet the liturgy of defeat, with Rostam at its center, became the logic by which each new Iran claimed its place as both the inheritor and the challenger of its conquerors. To remember Rostam is to refuse erasure. His legacy and the Persian genius for transmuting loss into identity remains an uneasy gift, a shadow that lengthens with every new reckoning. The fire is not what it was, but it still burns. And in the silence that follows every defeat, the work of mourning continues, shaping a nation that has learned, with bitter wisdom, how to endure in the shadow of its own vanishing.
Epilogue, Ashes and the Covenant. In the end, every story about loss is a story about return. Not the return of what was lost, but the return of those who remember, the ones who keep vigil at the edge of ruin, tending the last embers because no one else will. Iran's epic is not in the victories paraded before the world, but in the silent, stubborn refusal to let the old fire go cold. Rostam Farrokhzad does not appear to us as a saint or a martyr, but as a witness. His defeat is not a failure of valor or vision, but the fate of anyone who dares to stand in defense of a world that has already given itself up. That is the Persian inheritance. To know the difference between survival and dignity, between nostalgia and the living work of grief. We live in the afterlife of those choices. Every attempt to abolish memory, to stamp out the names, the festivals, the ache of languages forced underground, has only proven how deep the covenant runs. The Persians do not choose defeat. They choose not to be finished by it. If there is meaning left, it is in this, that fire is kept, not by the powerful, but by the haunted and the faithful, by those who remember the terms of the contract. The one who stands at the end of the world, refusing the comfort of forgetting, is already the seed of what cannot be conquered. So let the conquerors write their proclamations and their histories. Let the towers rise and fall. The work that matters is done in silence, in the stories carried by those who would rather mourn truly than live falsely. The fire remains. The name is not erased. And somewhere, on the horizon of each new defeat, Iran stands again, ready to make ashes into covenant. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.